Tom, are you on the line? Hi, Tom. Hi, Tom. Are you guys taking the two chairs? Hi, Tom.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tom. I got an email from Rex saying that he could not find his discussant link.
Just give me a moment and I'll re-invite him.
Thank you.
I'm on now.
Oh,
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
So, good morning, everyone. We may be expecting a couple more folks, but let's do a quick round of introductions, and we may have a fairly big group here, so I think let's just do the panelist list, and I think a lot of others know each other already. Today is kind of a final synthesis discussion where I'd like to talk through the roadmap of where we are to date on integration, and then think a little further about next steps, strategies for extending the boundaries of existing models, making more use of their outputs and other efforts, other ways of integrating research kind of along various dimensions. And I hope this will be a discussion, an interactive process, not just me talking. So I'd like to welcome our panelists and attendees, and do a quick round of introductions among panelists. I think it'll take too long if we do everybody. So I'll just kind of do a quick roll call down the list. I'll start with myself. So I'm a Tom Fitteman from Ventana Systems. I'm kind of a dynamic modeling generalist, but I got my start in climate integrated assessment, which shares a lot of kind of common features with the kinds of problems that you're working on. I also do a lot of energy economy work, which also has some very close parallels. Normally I'm a model builder, but because this is a big system and you can't simply build a model in a day. Here I'm primarily facilitating thinking about what's the integrated big picture of this system and how can we use that roadmap to get more out of the research that we have. So this has been a big learning journey for me. And I'm super exciting and I hope it's as helpful for you. So let me run down the list here, starting with Cecilia.
Hi there, I'm Cecilia Morrison of the Norwegian Methodological Institute. I'm an oceanographer and I'm a member of the GoMRI Research Board and a big supporter of this particular theme.
Claire.
Hi, I'm Claire Paris, professor at the University of Miami Residency School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. I'm a biological oceanographer and a modeler, and I have designed and implement a 3D model for the Deepwater Horizon spill.
Thanks. Rex.
Yes, Rex Caffey, Director of the Center for Natural Resource Economics and Policy at LSU and Director of Marine Extension for Louisiana Sea Grant.
Krista.
I'm Krista Court. I'm an assistant professor in food and resource economics at University of Florida, and I am an economist and regional economic modeler.
Let's see, Callan.
Hi everyone, I'm Callan Yanoff. I'm with the GoMRI management team and I'm working on the synthesis and legacy effort.
And thanks. And Michelle.
Hi everyone, Michelle Massey. I'm an ecosystem and stock assessment modeler. I specialize in food web and ecosystem interactions, and I work at NOAA in Galveston, Texas as a fisheries biologist and primarily tasked with completing the white, pink, and brown shrimp stock assessments each year.
Great. And you've not been with us before, as I recall.
That's correct.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's see. The list is reordering itself on me. Helena.
Hi, I'm Helena Solo Gabriel. I'm a professor at the University of Miami. I'm an environmental engineer, and I'm on the organizing committee. Thank you.
Thanks. And John. So John Shepard. Who's in,
sorry,
oh,
couldn't find
there we
it.
go.
John Shepard from the University of Southampton. I'm a physicist, oceanographer interested in climate change and integrated assessment, and a research board member.
Great. Let's see, Kevin.
Yes, I'm Kevin Shaw. I'm the GoMRI program manager and just interested in the full range of these sessions.
Great. Natasha.
Hi, my name is Natasha Mendez-Ferrer. Just like Michelle Massey, this is my first time joining you. I'm a fishery biologist for the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council, and I will be working with their ecosystem-based fishery management plan.
Great. And your audio is a little bit in and out. I don't know if you can be a little closer to the mic when you speak or something.
Testing. I'm using a headset and I've been having some issues. I apologize.
Oh, well, that was loud and clear. So
oh, well,
great. Thanks. And welcome. I think you haven't been with us as well previously. Let's see, Lee.
Hi, my name is Lee Zimmerman. I'm with the GoMRI management team, just listening in and supporting today. Thank you.
Great. And welcome to, let's see, we have 17 people on the attendee list. Is there anybody who needs to be upgraded or unmuted so that you can speak. You can raise your hand. Actually, I see a couple of you, David Abramson and Denise Reed. So if anybody needs or has a brilliant idea along the way, you can add it to the chat. And I actually can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, but others will be monitoring it from time to time. So if you have a question, comment, you can inject it there, and we can unmute you dynamically as well. So don't hold back.
Tom, if David and Denise can introduce themselves because they were on the discussant list.
Sure. So let's go with David, and you may be muted by default. Looks like you're not. Hopefully we'll get them down the road here. Okay.
So I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, great.
I don't know why you didn't introduce. You can't see I'm on. This is Denise Reed.
For some reason, you came in on the attendee list instead of the panelist list.
I'm sorry. I clicked the link you sent me.
Yeah. Not sure what happened, but in any case, we have you now.
Thank you.
And let's see. I've unmuted David Abramson as well. Hopefully.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, so this is David Abramson. I'm a social and behavioral scientist and associate professor at NYU College of Global Public Health, and do public health disaster science.
Thanks, and welcome. Okay, let's go. So our task in this effort is to support synthesis across all of the GoMRI research domains to facilitate the development of essentially a conceptual design for an integrated model or integrated models that are linked to stakeholder questions about oil spills. And I think the decision focus is kind of key. So here's a sample question. Sea Grant has collected a big library of questions asked by stakeholders in a variety of contact engagements. So for example, there are lots of questions about dispersants. What did they do? Where do they go? What are the effects on food chains and first responders and other things of interest in the system? So the question is, does the research answer the question from the stakeholder's perspective? And if you look at the research, there are lots of articles about dispersants. So this is the text topic network from the titles of the 960 research articles on the GoMRI homepage. And dispersants are pretty central there. There's a lot of articles about their effects at various levels. and some of that is quite highly cited as well if you look at the broader literature. But I think at the same time, the question is not entirely answered from the stakeholder perspective, because it's answered at a fairly micro level in the research, whereas the stakeholders are interested in dispersants in context. So if you look at the kinds of questions people are asking, you find dispersants are still a central topic of interest to the stakeholders, but they're asking about it in the context of health impacts and community impacts and tourism and fishery effects downstream from effects of dispersants in the food chain and things like that. So I would speculate that at present it's hard for a stakeholder to go directly to the research and get an answer about sort of what to do next time with dispersants. What they have instead is in addition to the body of formal published research, there's a network of researchers and other kinds of tools that incorporate some of the insights that led to that or came out of that research, and they can turn to that for answers to their questions. So the process of integration, in a sense, is a process of carrying the detailed research about dispersants and other aspects of the system further down the stream so that the impacts can be understood with respect to health and communities and ecosystems and other things that people care about. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay, I'll keep going. So part of the reason for a decision focus is that the various kinds of human interventions in the system are pretty tightly connected to all four boxes of the system. So this is a diagram that John Shepard constructed to kind of conceptualize the scope of the system and organize it into some functional domains. But of course, when people make a decision about how much cleanup to do or where to close fisheries and beaches and all sorts of other things, in response to a spill, they're integrating information from a lot of these boxes. So dispersants aren't just about physics, they're also about socioeconomics and about health, because they may affect responders and they cost money and they have downstream effects on ecosystems. So really every box gets tangled up in the decisions that you make. It's hard to keep things in their stovepipes, particularly over the long term. The farther out in time you look, the more feedback carries effects through all four boxes. So when we think about answering these questions, we always have in the back of our minds some questions about who's the decision maker, who are their constituents, how are they going to use the information to change their behavior, change the allocation of resources that they're going to make, what's the specific question, on what time horizon and with what level of detail. And if you look at time scales, there are actually a lot of different scales of interest. There are spatial scales, from a state manager to a federal manager to a local manager, and then there are time scales looking at very short-term response kind of within the time horizon of an accident to long-term responses that may happen outside the context of a spill, or in the case of something like Deepwater Horizon, in the course of a long-term recovery process. And in these sessions, we're more focused on the right side of the diagram here. There's a separate thread, core area 7A, about operational modeling, which looks at some of the issues of, how do you deliver the forecast for the weather and the fate of the oil in the next few days to the people who are allocating resources on shore and so forth. And while we're thinking of time, there are also important time dimensions to how things unfold. So this is a conceptual view of what a spill does and what restoration does. So the gray line here is kind of business as usual variation in ecosystem services. The red line is what happens in the event of a spill. And the dashed line here is accelerated recovery from some kind of active restoration process. And we kind of critiqued this a couple of sessions ago and noted some important things about the sort of the vision here of the evolution over time. One is that the initial state of the system may already be depressed from non-oil spill insults to the ecosystem, or if you generalize this to the community. There may be things you can do before a spill happens to prepare to make the system more resilient, or to put resources in place to accelerate the response. In your sort of your worst nightmare, there may be permanent effects of the spill, so you are unable to recover to your initial state because of irreversible erosion of resources, or at least very long-term erosion. But the aspiration is to recover to a better state. Somebody called it bounce forward instead of bounce back. And that implies not just restoration of things that were damaged, but improvement of some of the things that led to the depressed initial state. And that could be, removal of cumulative insults to the ecosystem, or it could be improvement of community dynamics, so that you use education and healthcare and other kinds of things to make coastal communities better off than they were. That's a tall order. Any comments or thoughts on this? Does this span the scope of possibilities? Or are there kind of more generic dynamics that we haven't thought about here?
Hi, this is David Abramson. I had one quick comment about this.
Sure.
Which is, and I'm not sure if you're going to be showing this in a subsequent slide, but this is quite this outcome variable here of ecosystem services. It may represent a distinct path from that of population well-being and recovery. And is that a deliberate distinction that is being made? Because you can have population recovery that lags well beyond or well behind the ecosystem restoration.
So I'd say that's not a deliberate choice to exclude that. I was thinking of this as kind of a generic. So if you were to take the ecosystem services label up there and replace it with, mental health in your case, for example, you could see some of the same kinds of dynamics unfolding, but maybe there would be other things as well. I'm curious if it triggers any thoughts about how things might be different. So you just mentioned that the human community recovery might lag the ecosystem recovery.
Right. And so that the path that you're tracing here, the trajectory you're tracing, may be a compressed version of what the population recovery path.
Oh, I'm suddenly losing your audio.
Are you able to hear me now?
There. Yep.
Okay. So I was saying that the population recovery could be lagging in such a way that ecosystems is a compressed version of the model, and that population health might look the same as one of these, but extended over a much longer period of time. So if there's, for example, a 3-year or 5-year restoration effect for ecosystem services, maybe there's a 5 to 10-year effect for population. And it's related. The faster the ecosystem restoration, it's an interaction term.
If you could accelerate the ecosystem recovery, then you would also diminish the cumulative insult to the human system, and therefore hopefully kind of trigger fewer long-term effects in that as well.
Right.
Great.
Tom, this is Denise.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure what you would use this for, but kind of following on from that last comment, any individual aspect of the system is going to respond differently. So I think kind of portraying ecosystem services as a kind of black box fits all kind of implies that any one system, could take a number of these trajectories, but actually really any one facet of a system could take any one of these trajectories. So I think that, it's like ecosystem service A, ecosystem service B, they could have they could follow different pathways through this diagram. I don't know what you're going to do with the diagram, so that seems a pretty obvious point to me, but I think that's an important piece to convey if we're going to stakeholders, where they, for a specific geography or area, they realize utility from the system in lots of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Because one thing recovers on, the bounce forward line. It doesn't mean to say every aspect of the system is going to go on that line, even in an individual geography. Again, it depends on what you're going to do with the diagram.
Yeah. So, just to be concrete, so it could be quite different for seagrass versus mangroves versus fish versus oysters, for example. And it might be different in Florida versus Louisiana. In a sense, this diagram is purely here to trigger thinking about these things. There's nothing particular that we're going to do about it, although this creates a menu of things that we would be interested in. We'd like to see models have features like this. At least if we think these different kinds of behaviors can exist in reality, then obviously we want the models to be able to generate the same kinds of behaviors.
But you want that to be, going back to the previous comment, you want that to be service, not like oyster biomass. If you want it to be oyster harvest or the value of the oyster harvest, then those.
Yeah, so certainly those things should explicitly be in the models, at least in some cases. And again, it becomes a question of use. At some point, for things like the Deepwater Horizon damage assessment, ultimately there was a bottom line assessment of the value of all lost ecosystem services totaled up, but that had a bunch of different components to it, marine mammals and lost recreation and all sorts of other things. So probably most of the time where the decision makers live is going to be tied to some more specific resource, shellfish or something that they rely on in some way.
Well, I'm going to shut up in a minute, but somebody did invite me, so I guess I'm here to talk.
Please.
So the idea that they should all be in the model, okay, they can all be in a wiring diagram, but you have to recognize that, and there's a bunch of economists on the phone, so I'm getting out of my box here. But the idea that the service, what people get out of it, is the value of the oyster harvest maybe, is dependent on a whole bunch of externalities, which are not about the natural system in the Gulf of Mexico. So a good example at the minute is nobody is planting soybeans in coastal Louisiana, right? And that's nothing to do with the environment in coastal Louisiana. It's global externalities. So your ambition for what you show on your model needs to be kind of tractable in some way. And so I think just about how you express that vertical axis needs to be considered in that how many of these externalities about value you want to bring in. What's your end point in that kind of scale of issues that the natural environment impact of an oil spill is part of.
Great thought. And of course, that also becomes important as your time horizon extends. More and more kind of outside turbulence from the world has an impact on this as well. Okay. And actually, I see a comment in the chat from Steve Morosky that there's a diverse repertoire of timelines of the trajectory ranging from no discernible effect to decline and no recovery. So populations and species become functionally extinct. So let's not assume that trajectories are always impact and a rapid recovery. Yeah, certainly that was why I added the path-dependent permanent effect to the, in orange here, to the original diagram, because I thought the idea that things recovered precisely to the original trajectory was not likely to happen in all cases. There was one other item I forgot to speak to here, which is that the red one, which is worse before better restoration, and that's something that political systems have a tough time with, because it means you either have to make things worse in some material sense or spend a lot of money up front in order to make things better in the long run. And those kinds of intertemporal trade-offs are often painful for people, especially if it means spending money at a time that you're unemployed because your fishery or your beach is closed. And Ryan Takashita commented that the valuations are a negotiated settlement from the trustees with the responsible parties, and the values aren't necessarily representative of the valuations based on technical work. I think that's a good point as well. That's probably an area where you could improve the coordination in the long run by making the, essentially making the technical work into embedded in tools that would then become the standard for valuation in the long run. That's kind of happened in the climate integrated assessment space, although there's an enormous amount of variation and disagreement among the various models that are out there. Okay, let's keep going. So this is the 4-box framework. We pondered at one point whether there were other frameworks possible, and I think the everything is implicit already here, but the framework can be extended a bit to kind of close the loop on some things that happen really through the socioeconomic and human health boxes. So you'll see I've added boxes for governance, technology, industry activity, and spill response at the top here. So the 4-box view says a spill impacts the physics, that flows into the ecosystem. There's some feedback because the ecosystem affects transport of oil. And then together the physical distribution of oil and other toxins and the impacts on the ecosystem affect the human system through ecosystem services, essentially, as well as exposure, direct human exposure to toxins. And then the perception of those human system impacts drives people's goals for improvement of the system and leads them to either make investment in creating new technical options or changing the rules that the system operates under. And some of those things happen on very long time scales. Both, technology has a long pipeline from basic research to deployment, and creating a major framework like OPA or NEPA takes years or decades and may from time to time be unachievable just based on the state of the political system. Are there any other major domains that we've left out? Last time someone suggested one more that's not shown here, which is financing. That the financial sector, while it's part of the socioeconomic system, there's a big external financial sector that's responsible for capital allocation and insurance and things like that, which has huge effects on what happens in this system. And that's not too clear on this diagram. Okay.
I was gonna say, this is Claire Paris. I was gonna say about climate here, but we talk about ecosystems. Is the atmospheric system also included in the ecosystem?
Oh, good point. So I guess in a sense, we've been thinking of this as if the coupled ocean atmosphere modeling of the Gulf was in the physics box, but the global climate is not really. So that should be another kind of external input to the system. And I guess you could add then a whole class of other things like the sort of the inland continental economy and so on, are things that we haven't contemplated very much as we think about the 4 boxes. Finally, we want to make sure that what we're doing incorporates the sense of uncertainty so that people aren't kind of predicting what their best guess is for the future and then reacting to that, but instead looking at more sophisticated control strategies that, that respond to kind of the inevitable, predictable things, but also control other aspects of the system for desirable output and hedge against uncertainty. And probably a large fraction of the decisions that people are going to make are going to have to be in hedging mode, because you don't know where the oil is going to go, and you don't know what the dose response curves are on the toxic risk to humans, and they're just sort of ubiquitous uncertainties in every aspect of the system. So to the extent that we can, we'd like to support a mindset which is, let's make decisions that are responsive to those kinds of risk and uncertainty as opposed to sweeping it under the rug.
There was no concept of risk on that diagram, though.
Oh, so the
so I don't know what this slide represents relative to what you said, but in the words, the two kind of end members.
The picture is a representation of a forecast for the oil fate, which has an uncertain boundary, but it's certainly far from a full risk assessment.
Do you want to talk about this? You skimmed over it really quickly.
Well, actually, yeah, if you have thoughts about this, let's go for it.
Well, I don't know if this framing is something that you're using. I'm talking about the left, not the right. But what about something about if we know what it says, if we know what will happen, right? You never know what will happen. So I don't think that's a particularly useful way of framing it. If you know what might happen, then we'll know what our options are, right? And even in the diagram on the left, on the right, I mean, it might be an uncertain boundary, but it's going in one direction, it's not going west. So how you frame this about, and I think in the commentary that you just provided, we don't know what the dose response curves are, but what do we know? And so I think that sometimes, we scientists, we frame things about what we don't know, and we do not effectively convey what we do know. And so, so we may not know what the detailed dose response curves are, but does that mean we know nothing? And so particularly in a management decision-making context, what might seem like the information that we need from the scientist's perspective is not necessarily the information that's needed from the decision-maker or the manager's perspective. And on several slides ago, you had some framing that kind of acknowledged that. But it's not on the slide. So again, I don't know what's happening on this call or where we're going, so I might be talking about things that you don't want to talk about.
No, actually, this is a great time to take this up because the diagram at the right was an example of essentially an attempt to put confidence bounds on things, and it also sort of a reminder of the fact that there's actually an ASTM standard for reporting uncertainty in operational forecasts, and there's no such standard when you move to the long term or to other domains, like regional economic modeling. So this was kind of a placeholder for what should we be thinking about when we move into the space of human health risk and communities and things like that. And again, I think it is it's sort of nuanced. We know in the sense that we don't know nothing about human health risk. We just don't know precisely what sorts of cancers and exactly how much you're going to get out, for example. Let's let this bubble up to the surface again, because I'll show you an example that essentially ignores my own advice as we get a little bit further down the call. And we'll talk about the map of the system, and I think uncertainty is or knowledge gaps and knowledge opportunities where we do know things that can be exploited will surface in the process of doing this. So this is our current kind of schematic of the system that has emerged from all of our conversations to date, and it's pretty complicated. So let me build it up from some simpler pieces. here's an early view of the diagram from the first couple conversations about, I think it was health and ecosystems. And in general, an arrow on this diagram is an assertion of causality, but this is not fully specified as a model because we haven't indicated, you know, what are the nonlinearities, what are the state variables and their time constants, and all the other things that you would need to know in order to turn this into something that was more sort of real. Okay, so a couple of pathways through this piece. So this starts at the top with release of oil and spatial transport and degradation that tell you ultimately what the spatial concentration is in various ecosystems or beaches or other places that are of interest. And then from that, you can get several things. One is, you know, where fish are going to be at toxic risk and therefore where perceived safety of fishing is diminished, and you can close those areas. That affects the seafood harvest and reduces the income and employment of people in the fishing industry and the communities to which they belong. So this is a view that came out of the CMS work. Another possible view is that based on oiled shoreline and maybe other factors, media reporting, things like that, you get beach closures and other kinds of things that affect tourism. That also has an economic impact, and you can carry that through to spillovers in the non-fishing economy as well. It affects recreation. And then finally, when shifting gears to kind of the human health perspective, all of these things lead to human toxic exposure through various pathways, from cleanup activities, from consumption, from other activities, recreation on beaches, things like that. And these are conditioned by behavior. And those toxic exposures ultimately change the health status of people. Then when you think about mental health, this is sort of moving into David Abramson's territory. People are exposed to mental health impacts as well, both through direct exposure to toxins, but also indirectly through economic exposure. And then those effects are mediated by things like the state of the community and social relationships that may provide some stability or access to resources for people. And then there are a bunch of other links that we discussed, but which are not modeled, which are, for example, impacts on productivity, age structure and family planning, and the affordability of healthcare that emerge from these things.
And it's not very active, right? I mean, you know.
Just a moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not about projects. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess we decided there.
Getting a little crosstalk here.
The way we normally work these things is everybody.
Hi, Tom. Can you put Denise on mute?
Okay. Yep, there we go. Okay. So that was the initial picture, and you'll notice there's really very little detail about physics here. So then we kept plowing forward through other webinars, and we added an ecosystem view, which recognizes that the ecosystem is a bunch of interacting species, and this is kind of a cartoon of that process. It separates things into fish and everything else, which is inevitable for purposes of this diagram, but certainly not the way, Atlantis and Ecotran and things like that actually work, or how the real system works. But this was sort of a placeholder for all the complex interactions that happen within the ecosystem. And then that creates some additional dynamics. So for example, the seafood harvest and fisheries closures are now not just a function of distribution of toxins, but also of health of the biomass, and the seafood harvest feeds back to the biomass as well. That also adds over here a concept of other ecosystem services, which are delivering things like coastal protection and recreation, and a little later we'll see that's also contributing to other kinds of welfare. It makes the exposure from consumption of various kinds of seafood a little bit more clear. And then we get into some additional socioeconomic system effects. So for example, it's not just safety, but also consumer perceptions of safety and the impact that has on seafood prices and the capacity of the seafood industry. So these are more feedback responses where, for example, if the harvest is diminished by closures, or the value of the catch is diminished by shaken consumer confidence, then you're going to have less investment into the seafood industry going forward. And that could translate to other long-term spillover effects like lost markets that are difficult to regain once the system is recovered. So this might be an example of an area where even if the ecosystem recovers quickly, the social systems recover more slowly because of other kinds of path dependence in the system. Then we also noted that a key outcome is human welfare, and that's a multifaceted concept. So you want your decision making to recognize that and to value things that are both on and off market. So it's the economy directly, but also other ecosystem services and intrinsic knowledge, things like that. Information is also important in the social system. So the availability of good information about when things are safe and what behaviors are safe is helpful. And education also, of course, has other effects like on productivity and the economy as well, which is actually missing here, but obviously important. And if I keep going here, things started getting pretty complicated in our second round of conversations. So when we talked about physics and ecosystems, we recognized that there's kind of a complex interplay at different levels. So you have coupled ocean atmosphere models, and then you can exploit the outputs of those as inputs to Lagrangian models that essentially take the ocean atmosphere dynamics as invariant or maybe uncertain and use that to propagate other things through the system. And in that conversation, we also identified one gap to date, which is the dynamics of oil as an active participant in the ocean atmosphere system are not yet captured. We also talked about ecosystem that really other species includes a rich set of things that people care about in the sense of, say, wildlife, which is a major driver for cleanup and restoration efforts, but also things that matter like coastal habitat, reefs, wetlands, things like that. So we added kind of a placeholder for the richer interactions that are going on there. And then the other class of things that's important is microbial community, which can be both an influencer of transport of oil and may, via infectious disease, constitute a health risk for humans. So those are these green links from ecosystems here. And then finally, we spent some time talking about things that are really in the domain of the socioeconomic system to some extent, like the media frenzy, which has an effect on perceptions of safety, maybe mental health, and also drives cleanup and restoration efforts. And this brown territory up here at kind of the top left is really the operational modeling domain, looking at development of contingency plans, creation of modeling tools that make things like ocean modeling and forecasts of the oil fate available in real time to people who actually have to plan the cleanup efforts. So then, let's see, sorry. This is a complex system now.
Sorry, this is Claire Bears. Oh. Yes, I think there is a missing arrow, I would say, from the oiled wildlife and the microbe. I think we can link that to fish toxin and seafood harvest, because this is the bottom of the food chain. For example, if it is a plankton that is being affected by the oil, which is the case in during a blowout, because the water column is contaminated. So there is these missing links here.
Let's see. So the link being that the wildlife is influenced, or that the wildlife is reliant on these lower levels.
Is when you say oiled wildlife, you probably are thinking about birds and, you know, coastal species, but we can think about it as the plankton as well, and microbial food chain in the plankton for the microbe, for example. So these are directly linked to fish toxin and, you know, seafood harvest and so on and so forth.
So I think those processes are actually implicit in the links among these things, but you simply can't see it because this doesn't have enough resolution to capture that. So there's probably I think a message for stakeholders, for example, who have questions about these things, that this diagram doesn't really serve very well.
Right. But I would say, Tom, that is critical, because when we look at trade-offs, for example, of using this %, we have to think about the planktonic food chain as well. And if it's not explicit here, it will be difficult for the decision makers to make these decisions.
Yeah. Do you have sort of such a conceptual picture in the CMS work somewhere, or something that could be adopted? Or do you think it's adequately captured in your existing model, for example, and simply needs to be conveyed? Or is there also a to-do on the modeling front?
Well, the model, when we look at the impact assessment, we are measuring the oil in sediment, the oil shoreline, but also the volume of the water column that is toxic. So the toxic volume, basically. and this is affecting then the planktonic food chain. So yes, explicitly it is calculated with a concentration of PAH and other toxic oils.
Right. Do you think decision makers sort of appreciate the richness of the dynamics, or are they kind of thinking one step, you know, is the fish I'm about to eat toxic or not, without regard for these cumulative effects?
Yeah, I probably think that they think about the fish, but the point is that if you need to link, to make those links, because when you think about this percent, for example, which is one of the main questions that has been asked by the public, you know, is it affecting the food chain or not, the planktonic food chain? And this is dependent on also how much toxic oil there is in the water column. So it's linked. Whether they consider this or not as like the main factor, someone has to link those factors.
Right.
This is Michelle Massey. I'd just like to comment on what Claire's saying. I think you could probably maybe encompass that by calling it productivity of the system. So as a fisheries biologist, I mean, we're not talking about plankton, but as we move towards ecosystem-based fisheries management, we are, of course, interested in the productivity of the ecosystem and how that affects, you know, fish biomass, for example. And I think that's important. Now, you do have productivity already on this diagram, so maybe distinguishing them.
Yeah.
Productivity.
And this one is economic productivity. So this one is kind of the endogenous productivity of the food chain.
That's right.
Yeah.
Typically, we call it like ecosystem productivity.
I'm just going to
or primary
abbreviate
productivity.
Okay, yeah. So primary productivity, I guess, is a useful way to think about it. So it's sort of what's the entropy or free energy generation in the system. Okay. Other comments on this diagram? So this is the latest version after our last conversation, and there are a couple of things we added. So, for example, one being the concept that there are other stresses on the ecosystem in addition to the direct toxic effects of the oil. One being cleanup and restoration effort itself, which may disturb the coastline in various ways, for example. And then another being coastal development, or sort of the human coastal infrastructure and occupation of the ecosystem in various physical ways.
I have a couple of questions. This is Michelle Massey. Maybe comments. It looks like the only thing that's feeding into your assessed stocks is fish biomass. And I'd just like to note that other populations are being assessed, for example, marine mammals, and it's not just dependent on fish biomass. So either changing assessed stocks to assessed fish stocks, or if you're interested in all stocks, then moving that over or encompassing species biomass into assessed stocks.
So I'll just add a link as a placeholder here. So assessment is not just about fish. Does that mean that assessments of fish for purposes of setting catch limits or seasons or things like that include other information, or is that more about you're assessing marine mammals for their own sake in order to make other kinds of policy decisions?
Yeah, that's correct. I think both, but mostly the latter. So we are mostly focused on individual species assessments at this point. But again, as we move towards ecosystem-based fisheries management, of course, we'll start encompassing things like, you know, predator or marine mammal biomass and how that impacts the, you know, say, fish of interest. Another comment that I had as we're sort of working through this is for the seafood harvest. I think that this might also be driven by the assessed stock. So there's no link from the SS stock except for to closure, and maybe that's how it's affecting it, I guess, but there might be more of a direct link from the SS stock to the seafood harvest or back even. So we do account for fisheries catch in our stock assessment.
So you're thinking of other tools other than closures, like just season limits and
right.
Harvest or catch and technology limits and things like that.
Right, like size limits and things like that are affecting the seafood harvest, and then the seafood harvest is also driving the SS stock. So, you know, you can think about overfishing. So if we've overfished the stock, then it is going to affect it.
Yeah, so that process happens here. Here's the loop. So seafood harvest diminishes the fish biomass, and then you can, and then presumably that shows up in your assessment. But actually, you ought to be able to use that information directly as well in your assessment, since you know what was taken. So presumably a model would use that a little bit more intelligently.
Right, yeah, so we're using catch and stuff, right.
Yep. Yeah, so there's kind of a, there's a little control loop here, or a set of control loops around the decision making effort. And then of course the other control loop is that based on what you get out of the system, that affects prices and it affects reinvestment. So there's another set of feedback loops here on the industry side based on the productivity they're observing and how much effort how profitable it is to put more effort back into the system. Let's see, and I see a comment from David Abramson that there are a number of social and political systems not evident, perhaps because they're exogenous factors such as governance, including equity, effectiveness, and coordination of effort of governance actors, which will affect a number of factors in the top left corner of the system. Also missing are structural inequalities, poverty, and racism, which will relate to social capital and welfare. And I think that's a great comment. So there's a little bit of flavor of these things. So for example, there's a feedback loop here which says that community health influences mental health and also healthcare affordability, which is part of health status, which influences productivity of people in the economy, which affects income and employment, which provides the resources to sustain community health. But really that's a kind of a cartoon of what's really going on in the community. So there's a lot of additional things. You get a hint of governance up here at the top left. So the overarching regulatory framework is what drives the details of the response. But you could really say that there's another regulatory framework down in this part of the system roughly, which determines all sorts of things related to equity and health outcomes and things like that. So it's like, you know, do you have a privatized healthcare system or single payer or other things? These are all kind of the long-term rules that govern the system that are taken for granted somewhat, but which may also help to maintain the system in a depressed state with a lot of inequalities in it. Anybody want to comment on that? It's certainly an area that's rich for modeling and at the same time tough going. But it might also be an area where there are big opportunities to have a bounce forward instead of a bounce back kind of response or to improve the resilience of the system in anticipation of the next shock. Okay. Any other comments on this? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what we have. I'm just going to shift back to the slides for a moment here. So we've now talked a bit about what we know. I want to think about kind of what the model coverage is and use that as a way to identify gaps. And I'll list some things that we've already identified, but I think there are more, including these kinds of equity and governance and dynamics that we were just talking about. So if you go back to kind of the 4-box model of the system, we have quite a bit of model coverage of aspects, but I'd say we span the space much better in the top half of the diagram in the physics and ecosystem domain than we do in the bottom in the human health and socioeconomic systems. So in physics, we have both detailed kind of near field modeling of plumes, far field modeling of the whole Gulf, and that can happen in multiple ways. You can do a 3D simulation and then use the vector field out of that to do Lagrangian simulations. And there are various models that exploit pieces of that to start integrating in the ecosystems. If you get over to the far right in the ecosystems here, we also have detailed ecosystem models, ecosystem-specific models like Ecotran, which is the one that's shown with the phytoplankton prominently in it. And also genome models. Atlantis is over in that box. And then hybrids that exploit kind of both pieces in order to track things around the system and look at how the microbial community influences soil transport and degradation and things like that. And then you can exploit that information to do things like look at the economic impacts of fisheries closures and of recreational access as influenced by the fate of the oil. Then over in the health box, the top left model there is beaches, which is taking spatial distribution of various constituents of oil and dispersants, running them through an exposure model that captures behavior and then a toxicity model to get human health impacts, which can then be mapped. Then kind of on the human health and socioeconomic system boundary are a couple of diagrams from David Abramson's presentation looking at how human mental health impacts are mediated by the social context in which the individuals live. So the kind of the community resources and state that prevails at the time a disaster occurs. So in our last conversation, we talked about some things that we're missing. So one is dynamically active oil up in the physics box. Another is in the ecosystems, dose response curves are unknown for a lot of constituents of oil. And we also don't know much about the behavioral response of mobile species. Then in the socioeconomic box, we have some examples of regional economic spillovers from direct economic impacts of fisheries and tourism, but we don't have kind of a fully integrated regional economic model as a routine tool. And then we don't have a kind of a long-term community dynamics model that captures the kinds of things David was talking about, education, long-term health and health care, poverty, equity, sort of various aspects of social justice, and maybe also the governance system. And I see in the chat, Lori Backer commented that about vulnerable communities preparedness at various scales, so personal, community, and regional levels. That's another thing that's missing here as well. And then on the human health side, we don't know much about physical mental interactions. We don't know about the dose response curves. And we don't have a clear picture of impacts of health back to the economy. And there might be some ways to get some of these things. So for example, it was suggested that you can do observational health studies on the effect of oil on responders and other exposed groups in order to get at this. Kind of in the same sense that the mental health assessment looked at economic and direct exposure to oil as a driver of mental health effects. So in the bottom half of the system, there's a lot we don't know. And Denise asks, how well do the physics and transport models cope with inshore and estuarine systems? Do they include vegetated habitats? And I believe the answer is yes, for at least some of the research. Maybe somebody in the ecosystem space can comment on that. Anybody want to take that question?
This is Claire Paris. These physical transport models operate at different scales. So if you have a model that is resolving the transport inside the vegetated habitat, it will. But at this point, I don't think we have this kind of precision. So we can say how much oil is getting into the coastline in certain bean size. And that can be precise because the interpolation scheme, for example, of the connectivity modeling system is very precise. But from there to look at the impact of the vegetated habitat, it will require like a more coastal model, a very high resolution inlet model that doesn't exist for the Gulf of Mexico, to my knowledge.
And another comment that most basin-wide models do not resolve estuaries but parameterize them. So I guess that also means then that if you want to model coastal defense, booming and things like that, then you don't have a model for that directly as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
I also recall from an earlier conversation that that at least some structural aspects of biomass like seagrass are captured in things like Atlantis. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. That's true?
Yeah, that's correct. This is Michelle.
So at least some of the habitat effects of vegetation would be captured.
Yeah, there is a habitat degradation routine built into the Atlantis framework, and it's sort of generic in that it degrades it. So you could say a percentage, basically, and it's over time, but you can get it down to a 12-hour time step because that's what Atlantis runs in. And then you could, of course, make some assumptions about your ecosystem. So say your degradation is known to impact certain species, and then you could apply some sort of growth or mortality forcing in the model to affect those species, and it would sort of get at that degradation at a different level. But those are different ways you can capture some sort of habitat degradation.
Right. So then essentially you're parameterizing these things, well, which of course is not a bad thing, but that opens up the possibility of a path-dependent or an irreversible response, and that you poison all your seagrass, and then that has cascade effects throughout the system.
Yes, that's correct.
Does that then feed back to things like coastal erosion, or is that beyond the scope?
So the habitat degradation routine is sort of encompassing a coastal erosion type scenario. It wouldn't necessarily feed back into it, and at this time there's no way to regrade, I don't know what the word would be, the habitat. So if you degrade it, you could have, say, a time series of 10 years in the past where you degraded it, and then project it forward 5 years after that. So the degradation routine would stop essentially at that 10-year mark, and then progress forward with the model 5 years ahead with no more degradation. And you could see you would expect to see the ecosystem recover in that time, or whatever aspect of it would recover. But there's no guarantee that it's going to work exactly as designed. So in that situation, you're kind of letting Atlantis guide you. And if you wanted to see some sort of habitat recovery, it might be better to then actually explicitly model it instead of implicitly within the model. So for example, you degrade the growth of seagrass based on your expert opinion of how whatever the impacts would affect seagrass, and then you run that in a time series for say 5 to 10 years, and then you stop that degradation and allow seagrass to recover again.
Great. And incidentally, I just unmuted a couple people that I'd turned off in an attempt to close some noise earlier. Apologies for that. Denise, did you want to ask your question?
Well, I think that the trouble with this discussion about modeling is that we don't know what you're going to use them for. And so we started the call with the stakeholder questions, and there are issues about how such, or when the slide was up, I don't know, all I can see at the minute is my name on the screen, but the slide had lots of different models, but really they have to integrate in some way in order to address the issues that the stakeholders want to know. And so, so there are issues about spatial and temporal resolution of the individual modeling platforms or frameworks that you had on the screen just now. But there's also really the issue about how they collectively work together to provide the answers to a stakeholder question, which may or may not be at the whole system scale. They may be more local. And whether or not so my question previously was about the kind of the physical ecological processes kind of inshore, and it's difficult to imagine that they would be captured at a resolution that that represented the dynamics of the system when integrated into a very large scale model. I mean, it's possible, and maybe that is the way it works, but I think the issue is, I mean, at the minute we're talking about, do we have the right blue words on the screen? And even if we have the right blue words on the screen, if they don't connect to one another, then we don't have what we need. And so, there's different issues here that and if I was the cause of some noise earlier, I do apologize. Things happen in one day.
No problem. Yeah, and so I guess in a sense, there's a meta level question there, which is, what is the process that would cause the missing blue models to emerge from the unanswered questions that are out there. How do you make those questions more tangible to the modelers? And of course, modelers always have lots of idea about what's the next extension of the model. So also, how do you connect the resources to the modelers so that they're better able to exploit what they have and use it to answer those questions?
This is Krista Court. Can I make a comment here?
Please.
In this synthesis effort, has there been any talk of like deriving an ontology across these models so that we could make that integration step a little bit easier if we were using the same language or at least the same names for variables that are similar within each of them?
Only sort of obliquely. We talked about the possibility of generating repositories of simulation output. So for example, in the physics space, if you had a model intercomparison project or something, you could then generate runs for either real accidents or a specified set of hypothetical accidents, and then you would have spatially explicit model output for a bunch of constituent chemicals in an online repository, which then the people on the health and socioeconomic side could grab as an input scenario and use that as a driver for their models.
Right, I'm imagining a scenario where we have some sort of object-oriented integration where we take a better whole. And I think an ontology would be a necessary first step towards that.
Right, yeah, so to build that repository, you would have to agree on what the variables of interest are and units of measure and definitions and all those things, and as a way of doing that. It's probably harder on the socioeconomic and health side, just because there isn't a built-in agreement on what community resilience even means. So you'd have to unpack those things to more easily quantified things. But my guess is that ontology would have to emerge after you had done some more modeling. So you have the ontology in the regional economic models because they have an input-output table or a social accounting matrix, and the way to measure those accounts is well agreed upon. But that's not true when you look at education and equity and racism and mental health and all the other aspects of that system that are equally important to the economy that's on the books.
This kind of reminds me of like interoperability and data management,
Yeah. And of course, another way to solve it is to create projects that integrate these things and give them the resources to let them figure it out internally. But there's probably some benefit to trying to do this as a community so that we have shared resources. I know in the climate space, the physical scientists have done that to a large extent, and then that later turned into a kind of a physical social integration where the social scientists generate emissions trajectories and the physical side plugs that into the models and generates spatially explicit temperature and precipitation and sea level trajectories that then can go back into the socioeconomic models as impacts, or as information that you use to parameterize models that integrate the whole thing.
Tom, this is John here.
Yeah.
The last few comments have been really, really good because they're taking us away from talking more about the details and whether we have everything that we should on this diagram into the issue of, you know, what do we actually know how to model? What could we reasonably expect to model? And, you know, what interacts with what and how? And I think, you know, we're never going to get everything that is important on a cartoon, but I think thinking about the whole system and whether or not it's possible to even envisage creating an integrated model is really what we need to think about. And so I think you know, which bits do we really know relatively well how to do, and which bits do we not know how to do at all, and how do we link them all together? Those are the really important things to think about.
Absolutely. So in the spirit of that, let me show you something that's certainly a kind of an overreach, but I think is interesting for thinking about what this might look like. And actually, just by way of introduction, let me back up to one more piece. And sorry, I just need, oh, there we go. So if you think about the model scope from modeling a single process to modeling all of the 4 boxes, and maybe even, you know, governance and other things we haven't thought about, as one dimension of detail, or the richness of a model, and then as the detail as another aspect. So how many species or grid cells or networks among species does it consider? We have models at different levels. So at the bottom left here, we have lots of microscopic research that looks at, say, what's the impact of one chemical on one species, or somehow looks at a single process. You know, what's the effect of seagrass on stability of the coastline? Lots of things like that. And then modelers integrate that up into bigger models, so you can build a very detailed model of a single process, like a model of a plume. Obviously, that still includes multiple processes in it, because temperature and salinity and things like that matter, but it's basically a model of one thing. And you can then go to model a whole box like an ecosystem, and then start to integrate those things. So you can model 2 boxes, the eco-ocean interactions, for example, with oil transport influencing the ecosystem dynamics. Health risk is probably actually should be moved over a little bit to the right here, where you're taking input from physics box to get the distribution of oil, and then you're using all of the constituents to model the evolution of human health. But there's some unoccupied territory in this diagram down at the bottom right, which is there's nothing that integrates all 4 boxes at either a high level of detail or a low level of detail. I guess the ideal model would be up in the top right corner, where you model every aspect of the Gulf with all of its natural level of detail, all the species and spatial zones or grid cells or whatever it is you need to do that, and all of the onshore cities by name and so on. But that model is impossible to build. So if you want to look at the big picture across lots of boxes in a completely integrated way, then you have to go to a very low level of detail and parameterize things within each of the individual boxes. So as a kind of an exercise in my own thinking, I did that. So if you track this through, here's a 0-dimensional model of physics of oil in the ocean. So you have release of toxins into the water. They get buried in sediment. They float to the surface. They get beached, wind up on shore. And in each of those locations, there's some degradation process from microbes or ultraviolet light or whatever it is that creates long-term removal. And then you have some defense options. You can clean up, you can deploy booms to keep the stuff on the surface of the water from winding up on the shore and in your estuaries, and you can skim it off the surface. And of course, this implies lots of parameters that I've hidden here for simplicity that we don't need to get into, but obviously getting this parameterized would be a significant challenge. Next up, you have ecosystems, and here again I've gone completely aggregate, so we already have good ecosystem models, certainly far better than anything I could cook up in short term. But you have biomass, which regenerates and degrades based on natural loss rates as well as toxic mortality, and you harvest a certain amount of the biomass. To some extent, the biomass consists of things like seagrass that are stabilizing your coastal habitat, or mangroves, things like that, reefs that provide structure for other species, and that determines the carrying capacity for the biomass. And this is all influenced by the physics box, because toxic exposure shuts down your harvest, kills off your species through toxicity, and shore cleanup disturbs your habitats. All of this influences socioeconomic systems. So you have, from the ecosystem, you're harvesting resources. You also have toxins affecting tourism and consumer confidence. All of that feeds into your economy, along with the cost of cleaning up the spill. So cleaning up the shore, doing active restoration of the habitat, and so on. And there's feedback in the economy through both capital investment, which I haven't built in a regional economic model here, but also the long-term socioeconomic dynamics of a certain amount of the value of the coastal economy winds up in the education system and other kinds of social investments that create human capital, and that influences productivity. People are also looking at how's the economy feel, which is a function of how the economy is versus how it was a couple of years ago. And then finally, health effects. So as you expose people to toxins through various pathways, you create immediate acute effects, and you also initiate a long delayed process of creating chronic health effects. The prevalence of health effects is one stressor that degrades the mental health of people. Another one is the economy. When the economy is underperforming, people are unemployed and so on, that's another source of stress. And there's also a natural restoration process in mental health. And mental health creates some chronic risk in itself. So if you have degraded mental health, then people have sort of accelerated risk of chronic health effects. Some of these things are highly uncertain, and all of them are made up or nearly made up by me at the moment. So this is just a cartoon of what the real system is doing. But here's the picture that this gives you. Here's a base case oil spill. So this is, if you think about this from a stakeholder perspective, it's kind of a control panel for the full system. So a spill occurs at year one, you have a lot of toxins, and then they quickly dissipate, but there's a long tail from release of buried sediments and things like that. there's a huge impact on the biomass, and as a result, over a longer time scale, habitat is eroded as well. Lots of health effects, and at the moment, you'll notice there's no mental health loop active. So if you start to think about what are the feedbacks in the socioeconomic system, if people's mental health responds to economic pressure and to health impacts, now you start to see their mental health degrading in response to the spill. If that creates additional chronic risk in itself, that makes things even worse. And as you continue to add the feedback in the socioeconomic system, this starts to be a big disaster. So if mental health and physical health are important to productivity, then you have the kinds of things David was talking about early on, where the human system suffers long-term impacts that go far beyond the duration of kind of the toxic exposure from the spill, and even exceed the biomass effects. So now you have kind of the full feedback scenario for a disaster. So you, as a decision maker, you'd start to ask, okay, what could we do to mitigate this? So I'm just going to do an additional run here. So you'd like to do things like keep the oil off the surface through use of dispersants, even if that means some trade-off in toxicity. So I'm sort of reparametering the physics of the system through application of dispersants, and it'd be even better if you could do that in a way that improved the degradation of oil in the water column so that it never ends up being a problem on your beaches. So there's a mitigated picture of the system. And you can keep going. So now you'd like to clean up the system. So you can lower the threshold at which skimming and beach cleanup and other things are undertaken. But of course, there are trade-offs in that. So for example, cleaning up beaches disturbs habitat, even though it removes oil that is causing you problems. You might close fisheries for a while, and you'd like to do some active restoration to improve habitats. That, at least in the way I've set things up, is hard to do. Maybe you want to diminish people's behavioral exposure to oil, provide some support for mental health recovery, or maybe other aspects of community health. You can do more to close off features like beaches, but of course that may improve health impact, but on the other hand, it has worsens the economic hit in the short run as you do that. So there's trade-offs there. And you could improve the economic picture for people if you could, say, source more of the cleanup effort locally as opposed to with imported labor and other resources. So that's, so of course, so now we've done lots of mitigation, but that's not the only stakeholder who's interested in this. You could look at it from the perspective of BP or whoever's the responsible party, and you've now spent 50 or $100 billion, and so you may get some pushback, have to do, say, less active restoration or less of other kinds of cleanup. But you'd like to be able to make all of these decisions with full visibility of, okay, if we're going to do X amount of dispersant application or other sorts of mitigation efforts, what is that really going to do to the ecosystems and the health risk and other aspects of the system? So you can make the trade-offs that the political system is inevitably going to impose on you about what do you think you can afford and so on. So this is a sort of a vision that's at the absolute far corner of the complexity diagram from models that now exist. It closes a bunch of new feedback loops, like between the economy and mental health, but it also relies on a bunch of things that don't now exist or are extremely uncertain. So it's not clear what the pathway is to get this. So sort of using this as a straw dog or something to throw rocks at, what do you think this says about integration prospects and where as a modeling community the resources should be going?
Have you thought about making it less deterministic, doing it in a Bayesian framework or something?
Oh, that's a great point. Actually, that's where I said that I was later going to violate my own advice and show something deterministic. All of these things really should have confidence bounds on them or something. I don't know how much confidence bounds mean to your average end user. It may just make everything look fuzzy to them, but you want some way to convey the uncertainty rather than making these point predictions. And
another way of thinking about that would be to think about what you could actually validate. What are the cause-effect relationships or process interactions that you could actually validate the model with? Because I think if it was purely such a complex set of interactions was built purely on kind of research understanding, if you see what I mean, or
right.
Fundamental process dynamics. I mean, what could we actually validate? What do we actually have data on it? Because that would be important for somebody to kind of actually believe or use the outputs.
And I think in some domains that's pretty doable. So in physics, you can certainly parameterize this to other model runs, or you could pursue a different strategy. You sort of throw away the zero-dimensional model and you simply have a library or a repository of scenarios, or you simply integrate the CMS or something like that to handle that half of the system. I think the hard part is on the economy side, where you can validate, you sort of have measurements of what's the value of the fish harvest and the tourism industry and other sectors of the economy, and that stuff is fairly non-controversial, and even the use of multipliers or regional economic models to get at spillover effects, that's all pretty straightforward. What's really not straightforward at all, I think, is looking at what's the payoff to education, what is even the definition of human capital, how does that affect the productivity of the economy in the future, and also maybe there's not much agreement about what's the objective function here. Is it the value of the coastal economy, or is it the value of the coastal economy to the bottom decile of your income distribution? And the same thing is true on the health side. Some of these things, like translation of surface toxic exposure into acute and chronic health effects, is at least reasonably well understood. Even if you don't know all the dose response curves, you can get at that. But closing the loop of making this fully endogenous from health effects influencing stress, influencing mental health, which in turn generates health risk, and modeling other aspects of the system, like what is this going to cost and what kind of stress does that put on the community. There's a lot of new territory in there that may have lots of individual pieces of research that come to bear on it, but we're far from having integrated models of this piece of the system. other thoughts on prospects of this kind of integration?
So one thought from some work we've done in Louisiana is actually to build the pieces that you can do and show how you can get that level of integration working to engender support, financial personnel expertise to build the other modules on. So if you could demonstrate that you could get the physics and the ecology working together in a way that people had some confidence in, and adding the other layers on, might open, but I think grabbing it all at once might be a bit of a big lift. I think demonstrating some utility, directly demonstrating the utility of the pieces that you, during this call anyway, that you have personally have expressed confidence in, making them work together, then that might be a first step. With the idea that that wouldn't be the end point, but unless you, because they feed into these other things, then you getting that done to begin with could be a good springboard to then move on to something more, much less, data rich or whatever is the health part. That's just
right. So actually, one implication of that might be that there's simply there ought to be better marketing, essentially, because we have some things that are integrated, CMS and Xomeo and so on, that produce extremely interesting outputs and also pretty pictures and useful results, like looking at community vulnerability, and perhaps more could be done to attract resources by essentially demonstrating those capabilities in a way that reaches a wider audience.
There aren't many really good tools that do ecosystem and physical processes and community vulnerability. I'm assuming you mean kind of citizens community, not ecological community, right?
Well, yeah, when I say community here, I was thinking citizens community.
Yeah, right.
Human community. Yeah.
So, I mean, we've got individual pieces. The screen that we had previously, where we had all the kind of images of the models and the blue words that describe them.
Yeah.
I was certainly talking about the challenges of actually making them work together, and other people kind of echoed that. And so if the things that you do have don't work together, then why would you even think that you could build, the things that you don't have yet onto that framework? So demonstrate, well, maybe not that one, but yeah, this one was the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yep.
You can demonstrate that you could make even the top part of that work together well. Then you'd have a chance, I think, of saying, well, we've got this bit working, we could add on a simple piece of this, But starting with it all, I would say, I can't imagine, that's a long-term, expensive, uncertain, high-risk effort that I can't imagine who would have the resources to support it. But, it's oil, so maybe there's lots of resources.
If you can get access, there's certainly lots of resources. It's a question of whether modelers get any. It's an interesting challenge in the climate space. The model that is probably, for better or for worse, had the biggest impact in the integrated assessment space is also the simplest model that you could literally draw on a napkin. It started off in 1990 or so as a pretty bad model, but it's evolved a lot. And it's had a lot of effect on policy. For example, getting used in the social cost of carbon assessment at the EPA.
Tom, this is John.
Yeah.
I think that those have been really good discussion. I think you mentioned earlier on the possibility of constructing a federation of models, possibly with some of them using simplified representation, something like emulators, and which is one of the ways the climate community has gone. Doing that, they're able to link sort of the top three right-hand side boxes, but the human health and especially the mental health part is really still missing. But I think if, Denise said if you could demonstrate building something that linked the existing bits and the top and right-hand side of this, because I think the bottom left-hand corner still needs some fundamental research. As you say, how do you even measure human capital and capacity? But at least you would know how to, if you knew how to do the top right-hand side, you would have some idea of what the challenges of doing the bottom left-hand side were as well.
And actually, I see a couple comments in the chats that suggest a possible way to do that. So, for example, Ryan said, providing guidance for restoration decision makers would be a reasonable and helpful goal for just the top half. So that would be a nice way to essentially make a useful tool that would then become the advertisement for extension of tools in general into other domains here.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a big lift, though. It's still a big lift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, taking a model out of the hands of the modelers and putting it into the hands of the users is an enormous task. Even if you don't have to change the model particularly, you still need a lot of other moving parts.
So this is Krista again, and I think there's a difference between, well, we've talked about communication and incentives and resources, but there's a difference between putting our efforts towards building a model or an integrated model of models, and what I see in some of the other disciplines is more of a community-wide effort for knowledge building, right? So where we do have the repository of models to select from or to work with, and maybe ideally they're open source where we can add to them and have this knowledge building enterprise rather than get resources towards building one particular model. And this is not to say that there's not, I think there is benefit in showing some of these, integrating a few small pieces first to show that it's possible. But I think that we do need to be communicating or creating this federation where we meet up regularly and say, I've been able to integrate these two, and I've been able to integrate these two, so that there's a much better way of knowledge building rather than the incremental way that it's being done right now, which has been driven by the incentives to publish papers and not answer questions or solve problems necessarily.
Yeah, so I think you said at least two key things there. So one was the word community, so getting the modelers together to essentially think about that diagram we were looking at a minute ago and be thinking about what are the gaps and how are we going to fill them, and essentially building a long-term research program that will fill in the map. And then the other is staying connected to the questions. So at some point during this process, we've populated this diagram of what are the kinds of decisions at different levels that people are interested in. And I think there's a lot more that could be done, maybe partly exploiting what Sea Grant already knows to fill this in and use this or something like this as a way to ensure that the modelers are connected to the questions. I mean, there is another thing that modelers are doing that's really important that happens kind of organically, which is the, say the ecosystem integrated modelers are taking lots of microscopic ecosystem research on individual species and processes and things like that, and they're building it into their models as structure or parameters and integrating all of that knowledge. And that's a super important part of the kind of scientific integration process. But ideally we could come at it from both directions so that they're also targeting the questions, and the questions go to the integrated modelers, and the integrated modelers use, that identifies a cascade of questions that ideally they would feed to the research community, so that the micro foundations are getting built for the macro models that answer the questions for the decision makers.
Hey, Tom, this is Michelle. I'd just like to comment on one thing. Being an Atlantis modeler, I actually went through a similar exercise with another agency before, where they were using a Bayes network model and trying to incorporate Atlantis outputs. And just something to be considerate of is that, let's just say as a scenario, you have some uncertainty around the spatial concentration of your oil, and how does that play into species biomass? Well, Atlantis is driven by, point estimates. So you're going to have some trouble getting some uncertainty bounds out of those estimates. It takes a little bit of work. So for example, if I had several scenarios on concentration of oils, I'm going to need to run maybe 50 to 100 Atlantis scenarios to get a distribution of uncertainty. And so that does take some time. So I think just being cognizant of the fact that different models are going to be able to explain uncertainty for you differently is something to consider in this whole integrated modeling approach.
Right. So you have to essentially brute force it through Atlantis, which might be resource limited essentially. And presumably the input uncertainty makes some of the detail of Atlantis less relevant. So if you're kind of thinking about a blurry uncertainty picture of things, you could get by with a simpler model that captured just the most important kind of transfer of inputs to outputs. But the problem is you don't a priori know which ones are most important until you've done it with Atlantis. And then maybe you could distill down to a simpler model. Okay, we're out of time, but I'm just wondering if there are any next steps or parting shots that anybody would like to convey to us to ponder in the final report, or to the organizing committee.
Yeah, this is Rex. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I'll go through a few really quickly. I thought your dynamic exercise was interesting, but it didn't seem like there were tipping points or threshold effects on the economic side, maybe on some of the others for biomass or certain ecosystem services. I could see where certain levels being exceeded would cause a system not to recover at all. So you might want to try and find a way to capture that. On the spaghetti modeling and the validation of these feedback loops, conceptually that could be depicted by thickness of lines or some statistical ranges, but the real question to me is what your objective functions are with these, and who gets to decide that. And that's not something that's a sort of a quantitative exercise. It's more of a philosophical one. And I think it's a limitation you need to include, because we can have the best physical model that links well to a biological model, even does a fairly good job trying to make socioeconomic predictions, but it can look completely different based on how it is scaled over time, over space, who gets to decide that parameterization, who's at the table, sort of the democracy of who's involved. And I don't know that that's really being captured here, but it's a huge limitation.
Yeah, certainly for example, the aggregate model I showed didn't have any classes of people or income distribution in it at all. So right away, you've thrown out a whole set of questions that are of enormous interest to maybe your most vulnerable people.
Yeah, well, yeah. And I don't know that there's an easy or single or good way to do it, but I think at the extremes, you have an expert panel approach to this, which suffers from composition bias, and then the other extreme would be a complete democratization of this, which would probably be just as bothersome. So there has to be either a parallel approach or some trade-off between the two, but I could see a situation, for example, when we get into things like ecosystem-based fisheries, where any negative feedback is going to be seen as an unacceptable feedback, and there's just no realistic way to proceed in that sort of no impact scenario. So the question gets to really quickly, who decides what the impact's going to be? Who gets to decide the trade-off? I think that's an unanswerable question at this point, but it's a limitation you need to have in there.
Mm-hmm. Great thoughts. I'm happy to stick around and chat with anybody you'd like to stay, but otherwise I'd like to just thank our panelists and thank everybody who attended for a bunch of terrific thoughts. This has been really a fascinating process for me, and I hope for you as well. I'll just read one more comment from David Abramson, that a strategy might be to identify the largest levers in the macro system which are of greatest interest to stakeholders, those forces which have the greatest effects on human health and well-being. Those levers could serve as a starting point research hypothesis for a variety of scientists to test and validate using ecological and epidemiological data. And Denise replied, I think a similar approach is known as decision scaling, where you identify that the decision is actually sensitive to the potential model outputs. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Great job. Thank you.
Thanks.